Chris, it's a delight to be with you today. I look forward to our interview about your new book, 10 Years Hard Labour. Why did you write the book?
Well, I think very often people on the left of the political spectrum don't bother to recall the history of the movement, their involvement in it, and often cede that ground to our political opponents or the sort of right wing of the Labour Party, for example. There's probably more people who subscribe to that sort of political perspectives that seem to write about the history of the movement than there are those from the kind of left of the political spectrum where I kind of come from. So I just think that, I guess in a way, what I think Winston Churchill once said, history will be kind to me for I intend to write it. And there was so much nonsense being written about this period in the mainstream media, and indeed there's one or two books that have come out which I don't believe have given an accurate picture at all, a very slanted view. And so on that basis, I thought it was important to, correct the record, if you like, and put my version of events as I saw them, so that, there is at least that contrary opinion out there that people can read and then make their own judgment about, who's right.
Tell us about the Ed Miliband leadership period, because he was elected on a left-wing ticket with the support of the country's biggest unions.
Yes, he was, and I backed Ed Miliband for the leadership. I felt that he was offering a significant alternative to the direction that the Labour Party had taken, certainly under Tony Blair, but even under Neil Kinnock, I felt that it had been going in the wrong direction. And Ed Miliband said that, he wanted to turn the page on New Labour. He'd said things like, if we'd listened to our members a bit more when we were in government, we wouldn't have made as many mistakes. And I've often, made this point. Indeed, had the party leadership listened to its members, there wouldn't have been any British involvement in the war in Iraq. And indeed, that may have prevented the illegal war in Iraq from taking place. There wouldn't have been tuition fees, would not have been introduced. There wouldn't have been cutbacks in social security benefits. We would have had a proper industrial strategy and so on. And so, Ed, I think, was saying the right kind of things. And I felt that he did present the best possible chance of defeating his brother David, who was the Continuity New Labour candidate. And I felt that, people had seen through that whole New Labour project. There was a lot of enthusiasm and support for it, I think, in the early days when Tony Blair rode on the crest of a wave and got that landslide election victory in 1997. But a lot of people have become very disillusioned. Indeed, Labour had lost over 5 million votes in the intervening period from 97 to 2010. And so I think, Ed was someone who was offering a breath of fresh air. But unfortunately, when he got there, he didn't really deliver. I think he got taken prisoner by the right wing of the party, by the sort of New Labour apparatchiks, and as a consequence, he got blown off course. Either that, or he was, as it were, pulling the wool over members' eyes when he was putting himself forward as a genuine sort of left-wing alternative. He wasn't in the same category that Jeremy Corbyn was in terms of the agenda that he was pursuing, but compared to where we'd been as a Labour Party for certainly the last sort of since 1994 when Blair became the leader, it really was a very substantial, or what he seemed to be offering anyway, was a very substantial shift away from that. And that wasn't then delivered. He stuffed his shadow cabinet full of people who were essentially from that New Labour tradition, and as a consequence, we ended up really not being that much different, frankly, to the offer that was being put forward, by Gordon Brown and before him, Tony Blair. And so even things like scrapping the bedroom tax, when eventually Ed was persuaded to commit to that, it was seen as, or it was being portrayed as, some sort of revolutionary step, when in reality that should be the very basic sort of thing that the Labour Party should have been doing, and what a Labour government should have been offering. so consequently, I was very kind of disappointed, very disillusioned really with that period. I had a few runs. I mean, Ed did put me on the shadow front bench for a period for up to 3 years, but there were a lot of missteps in my opinion. Sort of not not seeking to derail, for example, some of the worst benefit cuts that were being made to the poorest people in the country. The mantra about cutting too far and too fast sort of seeded ground again to the kind of neoliberal agenda that somehow governments were responsible for the financial crash in 2008 and so on. And so over that period, I became, somewhat disillusioned. And so I think Ed offered a lot, but didn't really deliver it. And I sort of explain this in some detail in the book, really, and try to sort of, map out where I think Ed Miliband went wrong. However, having said that, one of the things that Ed Miliband did do, of course, was to push through the change in the voting system for electing the leader of the Labour Party, and introduced a one-member, one-vote system, where previously we'd had an electoral college where the votes were evenly divided between members of Parliament, the trade unions, and the ordinary rank and file members. And he pushed this through, and of course, thanks to that, we were able to elect Jeremy Corbyn, and that offered us a huge opportunity, which unfortunately wasn't seized either. But I think without Ed, of course, that would not have been possible. So, we have to thank him for small mercies, I suppose you might say.
What happened in the Falkirk constituency selection battle? Because Ed Miliband called in the police to investigate Unite, the union's tactics.
Well, that was one of the low points, I think, for me in terms of Ed Miliband's leadership. And what was happening in Falkirk, was a selection battle, obviously, for the next election. And the Unite the Union were recruiting members of the union or encouraging members of the union to join the party to help, so that they would be able to vote in the selection contest. And the Unite preferred candidate was a woman called Carrie Murphy, who at that time actually was working for Tom Watson, which is rather ironic given his role latterly in the efforts to undermine Jeremy Corbyn. But after that, she went on to work for Jeremy Corbyn as his chief of staff. But at that point in time, she was working for Tom Watson, and she was, as I say, the preferred candidate for Unite. And the Progress Group, which is a kind of right-wing grouping inside the Labour Party that was established to support Tony Blair's leadership some years previous, they'd got an alternative candidate, and they were objecting to the fact that Unite were essentially recruiting members to influence the selection process. Ironically, though, the Progress preferred candidate was doing exactly the same thing. They were seeking to recruit new members so that they would be able to prevail in the selection contest as well. And there was some publicity about this, and there was an allegation that Unite were acting outside the law, that we were recruiting or allegedly adding people who weren't really members at all, basically vacancy names and so on and so forth. And there was a suggestion by some Tory MPs that the police should be called in, and so Ed Miliband then, I suppose, decided to beat them to it by calling in the police himself. The police did mount an investigation, but there was no case to answer. It was thrown out. But when you're calling in the police to investigate a trade union which has been a pillar of the Labour Party and had funded it, had supported it through thick and thin, and had been recruiting members, one would have thought, I was thinking, well, I couldn't understand what the controversy was about. Surely, as a political party, we should be encouraging people to join the Labour Party, and particularly encouraging working class people to join the Labour Party, given that my naive view at that time was that the Labour Party, ought to be all about representing the interests of working class people. It, after all, was established by the trade union movement in 1900, and that was a very disappointing decision by Ed Miliband, and I think it showed really where his loyalties really lay. It didn't seem to me to be someone who, given his rhetoric in the leadership campaign as being very strongly supportive of the trade union movement, it turns out that he was willing to call the police on them. Actually, Stephen, not for recording now. I know we are recording. I don't know whether you can edit this out, but I'm getting a lot of feedback. As I'm speaking, my words are being replayed back to me, so I don't know if there's anything you can do about that.
No, I don't think there's anything I can do. I'm sorry about that.
That's okay.
You lost your seat in 2015, but so you threw yourself into the Labour leadership battle to support Jeremy Corbyn. Did you expect him to win?
No, I didn't even think he was going to get onto the ballot paper, actually, because the process for selecting a leader requires the candidates to achieve, I think it's 20% of the Parliamentary Labour Party to nominate them. And whether or not Jeremy could achieve that number was a moot point, to be honest with you. I think he required something like 35 or 36. No, I think it was 35 he required, and I think he ended up getting 36 in the end. He was lent the support of a few right-wingers who thought it would be good to have a left-wing voice so that they could basically crush that opinion in the subsequent election. I think they were shocked to see the level of support, how it grew. So I was not at all optimistic, but felt that it was important that we have that debate, that we have that discussion about the direction of the party, that we had an opportunity to examine some of the new Labour approach and its willingness to embrace neoliberal economics and the war machine, etc. And Jeremy offered a very refreshing alternative prospectus to the policy agenda that the party had embraced for, well, certainly the Blair era, but even before that under Neil Kinnock. And so it was, of course, a great celebration, I think, when Jeremy got onto the ballot paper. And to be honest with you, after losing my seat, I was very, depressed. It was a shock because we didn't expect to lose. All the opinion polls were suggesting that I'd win it by a, large margin. There was an Ashcroft poll suggesting we'd win by over 9,000. So when we lost by just 41 votes, it was a big shock. And we also discovered, actually, I cover this in the book, the fact that the returning officer had sort of named a number of electors, miscategorized them, shall I say, a number of electors as European citizens. These were Irish citizens who had a right to vote. And they were ruled out on the day. And given that we lost by 41, and I knew at least 60 Irish citizens, and there may have been others, who'd wanted to vote for us, but then were turned away at the polling station. So I was pretty depressed. So it was great to see Jeremy got onto the ballot paper, and that gave me, I feel like, a new lease of life. And I threw myself wholeheartedly into the campaign to support his nomination and to encourage people to vote for him. And I remember going to my first constituency party meeting, nomination meeting, and speaking in support of Jeremy. I remember looking at the members that were assembled there and thinking, I can't see that Jeremy's going to get much support here. This is me, my sort of, I suppose, biases, if you like, my prejudices, maybe, I don't know, or my misplaced view of judging people based on what they look like. Because all the popular view was that Jeremy's support came from old radicals and young hipsters. Well, there's nobody met that sort of description in the room. They're all kind of virtually all of them anyway, kind of middle-aged, elderly members of the party. And then Jeremy won that nomination in that meeting. I think it wasn't unanimous, but I think it was certainly overwhelming. I think the alternative candidate got 2 votes, and I think Jeremy got the rest. So that was a guy, and then that was then repeated at all of the nomination meetings that I went to, and then we started to see opinion polls coming out suggesting that Jeremy was going to do considerably better than was initially anticipated. I should have put a bet on. Actually, I'm not a betting man, but he was 200 to 1 when he first got nominated to become the leader. If I'd have put a few bob on that, I'd have made quite a bit of money. So that was amazing, really, to see that. One, to get him onto the ballot paper in the first place, then to see those right wingers left with egg on the face because Jeremy was incredibly popular, and that wasn't what they expected. It also introduced a system. This was Ed Miliband, to enable members to become registered supporters of the party. They were able to participate in the vote, and so lots of people were able to join for I think £2 or £3, and there's a massive surge of new members, full members, and associate members wanting to get behind Jeremy Corbyn, and it was then obvious after a month or two that Jeremy was going to win, and this is when the smears started, in an attempt to undermine him. But it was a really quite amazing time, and I genuinely thought that there was a real opportunity now to bring about, or to start to bring about anyway, a irreversible shift in the balance of wealth and power in favour of working people and the families, which was a manifesto commitment that had been included in the 1974 Labour Party manifesto, but was then abandoned in 1976 after Dennis Healey went to the International Monetary Fund on a false premise, and it had never ever really surfaced in the intervening period. But there was a real chance, it seemed to me, for Labour to return to its roots, to bring to deliver a kind of a sort of a socialist agenda, an anti-imperialist agenda, and we were full of hope, but unfortunately, as we subsequently discovered, that those hopes were dashed. But I do cover that all that hope that was invested in the Jeremy Corbyn leadership at that time in some detail in the book, which I hopefully has captured that sense of expectation that was really palpable, I think. And it was interesting as well when Giles Brandreth went around Guildford, the capital of the home counties, looking for secret socialists, and was stopping people on the street and asking them, going through a range of policies that Jeremy Corbyn supported, like strapping tuition fees and kicking the privateers out of the National Health Service, nationalising the utilities, railways and water, etc., and regulating the private rented sector, etc. And universally, everybody supported it. They were saying, "Oh yes, that's very, very sensible." And then Josh Branford got a little clipboard with him, and he switched it around and said, "Well, these are the policies of Jeremy Corbyn," and many of them then recoiled. But the point was, I think, that it demonstrated that the negative publicity that was being directed against Jeremy Corbyn didn't translate into the actual policy agenda that he was promoting. And so I think, again, that left me full of hope that if we got the chance to get a hearing for our policies, that we could win more and more people around. And obviously, in the end, when the election came in 2017, there's a big increase in vote share for the Labour Party since 1945.
You talk in the book about the efforts of the Parliamentary Labour Party to eject Corbyn almost as soon as he'd been elected, which culminated in that vote of no confidence in June 2016, followed by mass resignations from his front bench. You went on Newsnight to say the PLP had started a civil war against grassroots members, and it was a civil war the membership was determined to win. Looking back, how do you assess what happened next?
Well, we weren't successful in the end. I mean, I suppose it was a Pyrrhic victory. We did, push back against the saboteurs who were determined to crush Jeremy, to destroy him, to force him out of the leadership. But Jeremy was built to sterner stuff. He decided to, you know, fight back against the coup that was being pursued against him, and said that he would stand again for the leadership. I think I just hoped that he would just resign, and they could then install one of the, you know, the new Labour cutouts that were on offer. But Jeremy put himself forward. We again mobilised and secured an even bigger majority for Jeremy in the second leadership than he achieved in 2015. But looking back on that period, in some ways, it might have been better if Jeremy had not been allowed to stand as the leader, because I think there would have then been a split in the Labour Party. I think people would have, and it's a moot point again whether or not Jeremy would have supported this, because he's been very much a Labour Party animal in that sense. But I think had he not been allowed to stand, as I say, I think that could have precipitated that split in the party, the potentiality for a new movement, a new party led by Jeremy, to mount a real meaningful challenge then to the Labour Party's dominance of the sort of, you know, progressive vote in this country, because I mean they don't deserve that support, obviously, because they're not really delivering you know, progressive policies. They've embraced the kind of whole neoliberal agenda. But the role that was played by the PLP was truly shameful. I mean, the parliamentary Labour Party meetings were, I think, described by various individuals as absolutely brutal. There was no respect shown for Jeremy. I mean, people were just completely out of control the way in which they were seeking to intimidate and bully Jeremy and his supporters in Parliament to push them aside. But that, you know, they didn't succeed at that point in time, and Jeremy won that, as I've said, subsequent election with an even bigger majority, and then went on and secured the biggest increase in vote share for the Labour Party since 1945, despite the fact that there was a concerted effort by the Labour Party bureaucracy and many of the parliamentary Labour Party to actually sabotage Labour's chances of winning that next election. It was quite astonishing, really, that you've got people whose job it was to maximise Labour's support actually actively working against the party doing well in the election. And so resources were targeted on essentially safe Labour seats where some of the right-wing candidates were standing, right-wing Labour MPs were standing again, and resources were kept away from the target seats, certainly seats where Jeremy had supporters in place. For example, I was standing in the most marginal seat in England, having lost it in 2015 by just 41 votes. And there was no additional resources made available whatsoever. And that compared to 2010, where there were a lot more additional resources being made available from the party's head office, so direct mailers and things like that about Labour's, general sort of manifesto pledges, etc., which supplemented the local campaign. There were also resources made available for coordinators to help organise the campaign to local level in 2010. None of that was being made available actually to us. And it was only after I'd spoken to Jeremy that there were some additional resources for an additional mobilisation worker to help get the vote out and to coordinate the campaign, as it were. But the pledges that I was given, that there would be a number of direct mail letters going out to constituents focusing on Labour's key policy pledges, which were very, very popular, as was discovered when Giles Brandreth went around the country looking for secret socialists. They never materialised. Such was the scale of the operation to undermine, Jeremy's chances of success or getting people elected to Parliament who supported a kind of a socialist anti-imperialist policy agenda, they were actively sabotaged. I mean, we won despite in Derby North. We won despite the efforts of the bureaucracy of the party that was, as I say, working against us. Interestingly, I mean, I was even shown copies of the alleged letters that were going to go out, direct mail letters that were going to go out to constituents to see if I thought they were okay, if I had to sign them off and say this would be appropriate for your constituency. But none of them were ever sent. I mean, and we know that because we went, as we went around the country, I went around the constituency. I mean, we knocked on virtually every door. We asked people if they'd had any other communications, and nobody received them. Nobody saw anything from head office. So that was that was the sort of dirty tricks they were getting up to. And of course, they also engaged in a range of different ridiculous smears about Jeremy being a misogynist, even though he'd actually appointed more women to the shadow cabinet than any other leader in history. He was somehow still a misogynist. He was a Czech spy. There was all sorts of absurd accusations thrown at him. But the one that stuck, and the one that was used remorselessly by the Parliamentary Labour Party and the saboteurs and others who were seeking to undermine us, and particularly obviously outside of the party, the Israel lobby, although they have a lot of supporters inside the Labour Party, Parliamentary Labour Party, and around about at least half, I think, of the Parliamentary Labour Party who are members of the so-called Labour Friends of Israel. And so they used that smear about anti-Semitism relentlessly. And Jeremy's error was in treating the accusations as if they were made in good faith, and sought to try to placate his detractors by continually apologising for something that he was certainly not guilty of, nor was the party guilty of. But that, I think, more than anything, really damaged Jeremy to such an extent that he was unable then to withstand the absurd calls in 2019 to embrace a second referendum on the EU, on the membership of the European Union. So,
yeah, that accusation of anti-Semitism, he was accused of allowing it to flourish in the Labour Party, and you cover that in some detail in your book. But you also talk about how you yourself were accused of facilitating anti-Semitism, and how you were denounced by prominent people on the left like Owen Jones and the Novara media team, as well as being pilloried in the mainstream media. How do you answer those criticisms, and how did you survive that sustained onslaught?
Well, they were an out-and-out lie. I mean, I'd spent my life fighting racism. I, in my youth, was a member, one of the first members, actually, of the Anti-Nazi League. So I confronted genuine racists on the streets in my home town of Derby, but also in London. Participated in the big marches and demonstrations against the rise of the fascist National Front. I challenged casual racism on building sites, which was quite a thing then in the 1970s. And so they were an absolute out-and-out lies as far as it applied to me. They were an out-and-out lie as far as it was levelled at Jeremy, and an out-and-out lie as it was applied to the Labour Party as a whole. I mean, the figures that were subsequently revealed showed that there was something like something, I think it's in the order of 0.004% of the membership had some credible accusations of anti-Semitism levelled against them. I mean, there was, infinitesimally tiny. But unfortunately, Jeremy and his people around him set themselves sort of, an impossible standard by saying that, even one case of anti-Semitism is one case too many, which, we'd all agree with. But, given that anti-Semitism does exist in society, it'd be highly unusual for there to not be any semblance of anti-Semitism. An organisation that was, at that point in time, nearly 600,000 full members, and then you take into account affiliated and associate members of the party, it was around 850,000 individuals. And then, but the numbers that actually there've been a sort of, as it were, a credible accusation of anti-Semitism. I mean, they were in double figures. There's something like 10 or 12 people. I mean, it's just ridiculous to suggest that there was a major problem of anti-Semitism inside the Labour Party. When the figures were laid out, and it suggested that X numbers of people had been accused and X numbers of people had been suspended, it was very, very tiny. It was penny numbers still. But some of those people included people who were clearly not guilty of doing anything. It was manufactured accusations against them. So I'm talking of people like Ken Livingstone, for example, who's probably done more than anybody in public office to advance the cause of anti-racism during his time as the leader of the Greater London Council. But he was accused of anti-Semitism after he was defending Naz Shah, who'd been suspended from the Labour Party on the grounds that she was indulging in anti-Semitic tropes when she posted some things online before she was actually elected as a member of Parliament, 2 or 3 years before she was elected as a member of Parliament. And I mean, essentially, one of the things that she did was to share an image that was on the celebrated Jewish academic Norman Finkelstein's website, and it sort of superimposed an outline of Israel in the United States, and essentially was suggesting, well, problem solved. It's kind of just move Israel to the United States. And she shared that. I mean, and this was at a time when emotions were running high over the Israelis, one of the latest Israelis bombardments of Gaza. And so she shared that. And I think she'd also shared a quotation from Martin Luther King Jr., words to the effect that everything that Hitler did was legal. It was within the law, as it were. And she made some reference to that and to the what the Israelis were doing, and whilst they might be lawful in their terms, I mean the reality is it gets all kind of norms of acceptable behaviour by a country. The brutality that was being visited on the Palestinian people was quite shocking. Anyway, the point is that Ken went into the studios to defend Naz Shah, and I think he was talking to Vanessa Phelps, and she raised an issue about Hitler, and then he referenced the Havara transfer agreement, where the German Zionists made a deal with the Nazis to transfer some German Jews to Palestine. And this is a matter of historical record, and for that he was accused by John Mann of being a Nazi apologist, etc. And rather than defending him, which I think Jeremy should have done because he'd known Ken for 50 years or so, he stood by and allowed him to be suspended. Indeed, I think he even called for his suspension, saying that his language was offensive or unacceptable, or words to that effect. So there was things like that going on. People like Ken Livingstone was one of those people that were included in those statistics. People like Cyril Chilson, who is a Jewish guy who was born in Israel, served in the Israeli Defense Force, but had a Damascene conversion, was very strongly supportive of the Palestinian liberation, was a big supporter of Jeremy Corbyn. Parents had survived Auschwitz. He'd been a long-standing member of the Labour Party after moving to this country, and he was accused of anti-Semitism and expelled, actually, for bringing the party into disrepute on the grounds of anti-Semitism. And so those small figures that suggested that there was a minor, tiny problem of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party included people like that who clearly were not anti-Semitic. Tony Greenstein's another one, prominent critic of Zionism, whose father was a rabbi who confronted Oswald Mosley's fascists on the streets in the Battle of Cable Street in the 1930s. He was the first Jewish member actually to be targeted. Jackie Walker is another one. She was a prominent pro-Corbyn activist who was the vice chair of Momentum. Her parents actually were targeted by the McCarthyite witch hunt in the United States, which is why they ended up finishing up in the United Kingdom and growing up here. And then the irony of ironies, there was Jackie then being subjected to a McCarthy-style witch hunt inside the Labour Party. She was another one of those statistics, if you like. So there was no issue of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, quite the contrary. And I was targeted because I defended people like that. I was the only MP that was willing to stand up to the anti-Semitism scam, to point out that Labour, wasn't driven by anti-Semitism, that there was certainly, wasn't a crisis at all. And I made the point, the thing that precipitated my suspension was when I was speaking to a packed momentum meeting in Sheffield, and said that Labour had been too apologetic about its record in standing up to racism, standing up to anti-Semitism, and that we'd done more to address the scourge of anti-Semitism than any other political party in the country. And that was then used as a pretext to suggest that somehow I was suggesting that Labour had been too apologetic about anti-Semitism. But that then precipitated, as I say, my suspension from the party. And what I was accused of was facilitating anti-Semitism. And what they said in the charge sheet, as it were, was that I wasn't guilty of anti-Semitism per se, but and that each individual example that they cited, didn't really amount to anti-Semitism, but taken together, it amounted to what they referred to as a pattern of behaviour. It was a sort of Orwellian catch-all phrase, as it were. So that ended up then being used as a pretext to suspend me from the party, ironically by Jenny Formby, who was brought in as an alleged Jeremy Corbyn ally, and she'd been very supportive to me personally prior to taking on the role. But I don't know, I guess because I was the only one willing to speak out on these issues and to defend people who are being falsely accused, I became an easy target, really, to take down. I was seen as Jeremy Corbyn's most vocal supporter in the parliamentary Labour Party, and I've been pushing a democracy agenda inside the Labour Party to make the parliamentary Labour Party accountable to members. And so I had a big target on my back. And because the Socialist Campaign Group were unwilling, Socialist Campaign Group of Labour MPs were unwilling to show solidarity with all the victims of this smear campaign, and because they weren't willing to, support me, it was easy, in a sense, for them to deliver the sort of coup de grace to get rid of me, which is what they did.
Sounds familiar, very familiar. You explain in your book,
yes,
Chris,
indeed,
you ended up taking legal action against the Labour Party after you were suspended, again after initially being reinstated, and then just before the High Court ruling or hearing, you were issued with a third suspension. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going again into some detail about this. I mean, when I was initially suspended, I mean, I was obviously very depressed about it. I'd given my whole life to the Labour Party, and it was, I mean, as somebody who's fought racism all their life, to then, be accused of being a racist, of being a bigot, it's quite a thing to, I mean, yourself, Stephen, you've had your own travails in this regard. Anyway, I went through the process, and the Labour Party's disciplinary process sort of Kafkaesque, really. You're not allowed to speak about any of it, and so my reputation was being, dragged through the gutter, as it were. But I couldn't say anything in my defence, as it were, because that would be seen as a further disciplinary if I were to say anything about, the process to which I was being subjected. So I'd had to keep quiet, keep my counsel. I was then reinstated, actually, in, I think it was June of 2019. And true to form, I wasn't notified of the decision. I found out about it from the media. In the same way, actually, when I was suspended, the first instance when I was suspended, I was initially told that Jeremy wanted me to issue a statement, some sort of apology, which I did, against my better judgment, and I wished I hadn't, because that was then weaponized against me. But I did that. So I went through that process. I'd got to the situation where I was reinstated, and when I was just going back to the thing about being suspended, so to say, when I told initially that Jeremy just wanted a statement. I issued that statement. Then I was told it had been elevated to a full investigation, full inquiry into what I was doing. But by the end of the day, it had been elevated to a full suspension. And I was actually just off the parliamentary estate, but I received a telephone call. And as I was taking the telephone call, Sky News TV crew came down the street because I was in the Red Lion pub, and I'd gone outside to escape the din of the pub so I could hear the call properly. And they then filmed me taking this call. And then as soon as I came off the phone, I was then bombarded with a series of questions about, would I like to apologise again? Will I be standing as a Labour candidate in the future? Had I spoken to Jeremy Corbyn, etc. So clearly, the Labour Party had tipped off the media before they bothered to tell me about it. And the same thing happened when I'd been reinstated. I got a call to say I'd been reinstated. And I was saying, well, you're telling me something I don't know. I mean, that's good news, but let me double check that that's what actually has happened. Anyway. I was reinstated, but then there was a massive furore, an outpouring of anger from the Parliamentary Labour Party, from the Zionist lobby, from the Board of Deputies of British Jews, from the Jewish Leadership Council, and so on and so forth. We're all screaming blue murder about this is an absolute outrage, what a disgrace that the Labour Party clearly aren't taking antisemitism seriously when they've actually reinstated me. And the furore was so great that Jenny Formby buckled and re-suspended me. But immediately prior to that, there'd been, I was told, 150 Labour members of Parliament and members of the House of Lords had signed a motion to go to the next Labour Party meeting, calling for the whip to be withdrawn for a year from me, and for an inquiry to be mounted into how it was possible that a panel of the National Executive Committee could have made this really perverse decision to reinstate me. And I'd actually asked some members of the campaign group to give me a letter of solidarity, a statement of solidarity, but unfortunately that wasn't forthcoming. They weren't willing to do that. So I was left very much on my own. And when then Jenny Formby intervened before the PLP meeting and resuspended me, I was only left with no alternative really but to seek a remedy through the law court. So I made an application to take my case, to appeal to the court, to the High Court. The Labour Party, Jenny Formby, had actually sought to try and delay the hearing. I was seeking an expedited hearing because there was a general election in the offing. We had 3 preliminary hearings, and the Labour Party's lawyers were arguing that at that point in time there was a fixed-term parliament. So they were claiming in the court that Mr. Williamson was merely speculating. There is no evidence of an early election. The election is going to be in 2022. And so there's no case for an expedited hearing. It was thrown out on every occasion because obviously the judges don't live in a vacuum. They could see that there was clearly speculation in the media about the possibility of an early election. The 2017 election had been called, at a whim, as it were. So, the fixed-term parliament was still in existence then in 2017. It had been brought in under the Tory Liberal Democrat coalition. So it obviously was possible to hold an early election if there was support for an early election in the House. If sufficient numbers of MPs voted for an early election, it was still possible to do. Anyway, so the judges threw that out on each occasion. And on the third occasion, actually set a date for the hearing to take place. And then 36 hours or so after that, I received a letter from the party. And I thought when I first saw the headed notepaper that they'd seen sense and that they were going to pull back and reinstate me. But it wasn't. It was to simply say, well, we know you're already suspended and this is going through a process. But fresh allegations have been made. And therefore, irrespective of the outcome of the High Court hearing, you will, you will remain suspended. I did actually try to ask the court to consider the third suspension as well, on the basis that it was clearly, in my opinion, and my lawyers agreed, a pretext to try and subvert the likely positive outcome in my favour of the appeal against the second suspension. But the judge took the view that it wasn't really for the court to intervene and micromanage the Labour Party's disciplinary procedures, and said that although the decision to suspend me for the second time was unlawful, that didn't insulate me from fresh allegations. And so these allegations, he said, hadn't gone through a process. They'd only been made 6 days before the hearing of the Labour Party. And on that basis, it wasn't really appropriate for the High Court to intervene. That was then reported in the mainstream media that, I'd lost the High Court hearing, and the Labour Party were cock a hoop that they, defeated me in the High Court. They put a statement out to that effect. The lawyer that was representing the party was heralded in the Times as lawyer of the week or the lawyer of the month or something, even though the substantive part of the case, the party had lost. And they were ordered to pay all of my costs, actually. Again, the Labour Party was seeking to make that difficult as well. And initially, they were asking for 60% of their costs, even though I'd won the substantive part of the case. It was quite astonishing. So it had to go to a cost hearing, another hearing, which took place just after the general election was called. So I didn't attend. But my lawyer said, look, we're confident that you'll get your costs. And we think, we're hopeful that we'll get 90% of your costs. But, it could be that, maybe it might be down as low as 70%, maybe even a bit less than that. But we're very, very confident that you will get a costs order against the party. The party hadn't got a legs to stand on for their 60%, wanting 60% of their costs. When it got to the hearing, the cost hearing, the judge didn't award me 90%, he awarded me 100% of my costs, up to 6 days before the hearing. And even for that period after the third suspension was issued, he awarded 30% of my costs for that as well. So the Labour Party ended up having to pay out something like £90,000 in costs, and to me, but obviously then their own costs as well. But for them to argue that in some way that they'd won that hearing when they'd had to pay all of my costs, I mean, you don't get your costs if you lose a case in the High Court. You do not get your costs awarded. The other side wins costs, as it were. So yeah, that's the sort of thing we were up against. But we ended up then in a situation where, I'd sort of won the substantive part of the hearing, but was still suspended from the party.
You also say in the book that Jeremy Corbyn assured you that you would be the official Labour candidate in 2019 election, but the following week the National Executive Council at NEC dumped you. How did that make you feel, and what did you do after that?
Well, betrayed, to be honest with you. I mean, Jeremy gave me an absolute cast-iron assurance that he'd spoken to the National Executive Committee, that he'd ensured that when they met the following week, that I would be installed as the official Labour Party candidate for Derby North in the election. But unfortunately, Jeremy didn't attend that meeting, and we were awaiting the outcome of the NEC's decision in my constituency office, and we put the TV on. And the first shock was that Jeremy Corbyn was on the screen taking questions at a press conference, and it looked like he was on the campaign trail. I thought, well, maybe it's a recording, because surely Jeremy is going to be at the National Executive Committee meeting. And then, just as we switched on, a journalist was asking about my case, and Jeremy said, well, I'm the leader of the party, I'm not a dictator, and the NEC will come to a view based on the facts and blah blah blah. But it turned out that there was a recommendation from Jenny Formby that I should be dumped as the official Labour Party candidate in the election, and the vote wasn't even close. It was 20 votes to 5. So yeah, I was unceremoniously thrown out, and I just don't know. I'd given nearly 44 years of my life to the Labour Party from being a teenager, And it felt like a real betrayal, a real sort of stab in the back. And I just decided there and then that I was going to resign from the party and fight the seat as an independent. Not on the basis that I thought we'd win, but I just felt that the bureaucrats that were treating people so abominably, there had to be, with impunity, there had to be some consequences for that. And me standing as an independent would have made it more difficult for the Labour Party to retain the seat. And they didn't retain the seat, but I mean, it was a disastrous night for the Labour Party across the country in any event. So that's what I ended up doing. We didn't win that, and then thereafter I've been involved in trying to build an alternative movement outside of the Labour Party to really start again. I think that we are in a situation that perhaps the country was in 1900 when the Labour Party was initially founded. Up until that point, of course, the Liberals were seen as the sort of alternative to the Tories, but people felt then that in reality they were two sides of the same coin, and that's what precipitated the Labour Party to be founded. The trade union movement felt that they wanted a genuine voice in Parliament to speak up for their interests, and the Liberals weren't doing that, clearly. And that's where we are today. The Labour Party is not speaking, even though they've got trade unions affiliated to the party. The Labour Party is not speaking up for the interests of ordinary working class people, certainly not for the trade union movement. Unfortunately, the Labour Party is in the pockets of the neo-liberal establishment and the war machine, the military-industrial complex. These are the vested interests of society, whose interests that the Labour Party stand up for, not for the interests of ordinary working people.
Last question, Chris. You conclude your book with a rallying cry for the left to work together. How is that turning out, and what are you doing now?
Well, I mean, there's some seeds, I suppose, some straws in the wind suggesting that there is an appetite for the left to collaborate. There needs to be a lot more serious effort, I think, put into collaborating to ensure that we can make some inroads against the two-party system in this country. The first past the post, of course, means that electoral system means that it's very difficult for an insurgent party to make any headway, and that's made even more difficult if you've got left-wing parties fighting against each other. And so I initially set up with others a movement called Resist. It got slightly knocked off kilter by the epidemic that we were all confronted with, that meant that the lockdown and so on that stopped people meeting and so on, and with the COVID restrictions, the opportunities to bring people together was severely limited for 18 months or so. But I'm involved with the Trade Union and Socialist Coalition, which was established by Bob Crow, the late leader of the RMT, the Rail Workers Union. And so I'm trying to work. I've joined the Workers' Party now as well. The Resist movement that I established has voted to throw its lot in with the Workers' Party. But we are still arguing that we have to work with others in order to make those inroads that I've mentioned. But the other key thing, and this is one of the reasons for establishing the Resist movement, was to encourage people to recognise that there's more to politics than simply putting a cross on a ballot paper once every few years. More to democracy than electing people to Parliament or into the local authority. And this is what was so exciting, really, I think, about Jeremy's leadership of the party in the early days, was it was very much about building a social movement as well as an electoral force. And so that's where I'm hoping to put some effort into continuing to build that vision of a social movement, because I think if we can achieve that, then that will not only be beneficial electorally, but it will also, I think, help to sustain change in the country. I mean, you kind of look to examples in Latin America, the movement towards socialism in Bolivia, for example, where Evo Morales, subject to a coup in 2019, was forcibly removed from office. But within a year, that social movement had forced the coup regime to call new elections, and the socialists came back with an even bigger majority in Bolivia than they'd achieved under Morales the year before. Which is 12 months. It's quite astonishing. Well, that's the power of a mass movement, of a social movement. When ordinary people stand together and recognise the power of their collective endeavour, then great things can happen. Together anything is possible, and so that's what I'm hoping to do, to try and work and try and encourage people to recognise their collective strength, so that we can, build a good society that cares for people, that uses the huge resources that Britain has to eradicate poverty and homelessness, and to also be a force for peace and disarmament around the world.
Chris, I'm very grateful to you for allowing me to interview you about your new book. If I want to get a copy, 10 Years Hard Labour, who publishes it?
It's published by Lola Books. It's available from Waterstones and various other platforms. Amazon, I know a lot of people are not keen on Amazon, but it's available through that platform. It's also available on Audible and Apple Books, etc. So I've recorded an audio book version of it as well. So you can use if people subscribe to Audible, you can use your credits to get a free copy effectively. It's all good bookshops should, if you ask them, they may not have it on the shelf, but they should be able to get it. But so Waterstones, Amazon, Audible, Apple Books, it's there for people to get if they've been interested and their appetite's been whetted by what they've heard today.
I'm sure they will. Chris, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
No worries. Thanks very much indeed for inviting me on.